Chapter 11 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. How William Dean Howells Worked to Secure a Foothold. In answer to my question, what constitutes success in life, Mr. Howells replied that everything is open to the beginner who has sufficient energy, perseverance, and brains. A young man stands at the parting of two ways, he added, and can take his path this way or that. It is comparatively easy, then, with good judgment. Youth is certainly the greatest advantage which life supplies. Upon my inquiring about his early life, he replied, I was born in a little southeastern Ohio village, Martin's Ferry, which had little of what people deem advantages in schools, railroads, or population. I am not sure, however, that compensation was not had in other things. As to any special talent for literary composition, Mr. Howells remarked that he came of a reading race which had always loved literature in a way, and that it was his inclination to read. Upon this, I ventured to ask, would you say that, with a leaning towards a special study and good health, a fair start, and perseverance, anyone can attain to distinction? That is probability only. You may be sure that distinction will not come without those qualities. The only way to succeed is to have them, although having them will not necessarily guarantee distinction. I can only say that I began with a lofty ideal. My own youth was not specially marked by advantages. There were none, unless you can call a small bookcase full of books, which my home contained, an advantage. The printing office was my school from a very early date. My father thoroughly believed in it, and he had his belief as to work, which he illustrated as soon as we were old enough to learn the trade he followed. We could go to school and study, or we could go into the printing office and work, with perhaps an equal chance of learning, but we could not be idle. And you chose the printing office? Not wholly. As I recall it, I went to and fro between the schoolhouse and the printing office. When I tired of one, I was promptly given the other. As the world goes now, we were poor. My father's income was never above $1,200 a year, and his family was large, but nobody was rich then. We lived in the simple fashion of that time and place. My reading, somehow, went on pretty constantly. No doubt my love for it won me a chance to devote time to it. The length varied with varying times. Sometimes I read but little. There were so many years of work, of overwork indeed, which falls to the lot of many, that I should be ashamed to speak of it except in accounting for the fact of my little reading. My father had sold his paper in Hamilton, and bought an interest in another at Dayton, and at that time we were all straining our utmost to help pay for it. In that period, very few hours were given to literature. My daily tasks began so early, and ended so late, that I had little time, even if I had the spirit for reading. Sometimes I had to sit up until midnight, waiting for telegraphic news, and be up again at dawn to deliver the papers, working afterwards at the case, but that was only for a few years. Acquiring a literary style. When did you find time to seriously apply yourself to literature? I think I did so before I really had the time. Literary aspirations were stirred in me by the great authors whom I successfully discovered, and I was perpetually imitating the writings of these, modeling some composition of my own after theirs, but never willing to own it. Do you attribute your style to the composite influence of these various models? No doubt they had their effect, as a whole, but individually I was freed from the last by each succeeding author, until at length I came to understand that I must be like myself and no other. Had you any conveniences for literary research beyond the bookcase in your home? If you mean a place to work, I had a narrow little space under the stairs. There was a desk pushed back against the wall, which the irregular ceiling sloped down to meet. Behind it, and at my left, was a window, which gave a good light on the writing leaf of my desk. This was my workshop. For 6 or 7 years, and it was not all a bad one. It seemed, for a whole, so very simple and easy to come home in the middle of the afternoon, when my task at the printing office was done, and sit down to my books in my little study, which I did not finally leave until the family were all in bed. My father had a decided bent for literature, and when I began to show a liking for it, he was eager to direct my choice. This finally changed to merely recommending books, and eventually I was left to my own judgment, a perplexed and sorrowfully mistaken judgment at times. In what manner did you manage to read the works of all your favorite authors? My hours at the printing office began at 7 and ended at 6, with an hour at noon for dinner, which I used for putting down such verses as had come to me in the morning. As soon as supper was over, I got out my manuscripts and sawed and filed and hammered away at my blessed poems, which were little less than imitations, until 9, when I went regularly to bed, to rise again at 5. Sometimes the foreman gave me an afternoon off on Saturday, which I devoted to literature. As I questioned further, it was said, as I recall it, my father had secured one of those legislative clerkships in 1858, which used to fall sometimes to deserving country editors, and together we managed and carried out a scheme for corresponding with some city papers. Going to Columbus, the state capital, we furnished a daily letter giving an account of the legislative proceedings, which I mainly wrote from the material he helped me to gather. The letters found favor, and my father withdrew from the work wholly. These letters I furnished during 2 years. At the end of the first winter, a Cincinnati paper offered me the city editorship, but one night's round with the reporters at the police station satisfied me that I was not meant for that kind of work. I then returned home for the summer, and spent my time in reading and in sending off poems, which regularly came back. I worked in my father's printing office, but, as soon as my task was done, went home to my books and worked away at them until supper. Then a German bookbinder, with whom I was endeavoring to read Heine in the original, met me in my father's editorial room, and with a couple of candles on the table between us, and our Heine and the dictionary before us, we read until we were both tired out. As to the influence of this constant writing and constant study, Mr. Howells remarked, it was not without its immediate use. I learned how to choose between words. After a study of their fitness, and, though I often employed them decoratively, and with no vital sense of their qualities, still, in mere decoration, they had to be chosen intelligently, and after some thought about their structure and meaning. I could not imitate great writers without imitating their method, which was to the last degree intelligent. They knew what they were doing, and although I didn't always know what I was doing, they made me wish to know, and ashamed of not knowing. The result was beneficial. Mr. Howells then spoke of his astonishment when one day he was at work as usual in the printing office at home, upon being invited to take a place upon a Republican newspaper at Columbus, the capital, where he was given charge of the news department. This included the literary notices and book reviews, to which at once he gave his prime attention. When did you begin to contribute to the literature of the day? If you mean, when did I begin to attempt to contribute, I should need to fix an early date, for I early had experience with rejected manuscripts. One of my pieces, upon the familiar theme of spring, was the first thing I ever had in print. My father offered it to the editor of the paper I worked on in Columbus, where we were then living, and I first knew what he had done, when the mingled shame and pride I saw it in the journal. In the tumult of my emotions, I promised myself that if I ever got through that experience safely, I would never suffer anything else of mine to be published, but it was not long before I offered the editor a poem myself. When did you publish your first story? My next venture was a story in the Ich Marvel manner, which it was my misfortune to carry into print. I did not really write it, but composed it, rather, in type, at the case. It was not altogether imitated from Ich Marvel, for I drew upon the easier art of Dickens at times, and helped myself out in places with bold parodies of Bleak House. It was all very well at the beginning, but I had not reckoned with the future sufficiently to start out with any clear ending in my mind, and, as I went on, I began to find myself more and more in doubt about it. My material gave out, my incidents failed me, the characters wavered, and threatened to perish in my hands. To crown my misery, there grew up an impatience with the story among its readers, and this found its way to me one day, when I overheard an old farmer, who came in for his paper, say that he did not think that story amounted to much. I did not think so either, but it was deadly to have it put into words, and how I escaped the moral effect of the stroke I do not know. Somehow, I managed to bring the wretched thing to a close, and to live it slowly down. The fate following collaboration. My next contribution to literature was jointly with John J. Piatt, the poet, who had worked with me as a boy in the printing office at Columbus. We met in Columbus, where I was then an editor, and we made our first literary venture together in a volume entitled Poems of Two Friends. The volume became instantly and lastingly unknown to fame. The West waited, as it always does, to hear what the East should say. The East said nothing, and 2/3 of the small edition of 500 copies came back upon the publisher's hands. This did not deter me, however, from contributing to the periodicals, which from time to time accepted my efforts. I remained as an editor in Columbus until 1861, when I was appointed consul at Venice. I really wanted to go to Germany, that I might carry forward my studies in German literature, and I first applied for the consulate at Munich. The powers at Washington thought it was quite the same thing to offer me to Rome, but I found that the income of the Roman consulate would not give me a living, and I was forced to decline it. Then the president's private secretaries, Mr. John Nicolay and Mr. John Hay, who did not know me, except as a young Westerner who had written poems in the Atlantic Monthly, asked me how I would like Venice, promising that the salary would be put up to $1,000 a year. It was really put up to $1,500, and I accepted. I had 4 years of nearly uninterrupted leisure at Venice. Was it easier when you returned from Venice? Not at all. On my return to America, my literary life took such form that most of my reading was done for review. I wrote at first a good many of the lighter criticisms in The Nation, and then I went to Boston to become assistant editor of the Atlantic Monthly, where I wrote the literary notices for that periodical for 4 or 5 years. Then I became editor until 1881, and I have had some sort of close relation with magazines ever since. Would you say that all literary success is very difficult to achieve? I ventured. All that is enduring. It seems to me ours is an age when fame comes quickly. Speaking of quickly made reputations, said Mr. Howells meditatively, did you ever hear of Alexander Smith? He was a poet who, in the 50s, was proclaimed immortal by the critics and ranked with Shakespeare. I myself read him with an ecstasy which, when I look over his work today, seems ridiculous. His poem, Life Drama, was heralded as an epic, and set alongside of Paradise Lost. I cannot tell how we all came out of this craze, but the reading world is very susceptible to such lunacies. He is not the only third-rate poet who has been thus apotheosized, before and since. You might have envied his great success, as I certainly did, but it was not success after all, and I am sure that real success is always difficult to achieve. My literary experience. Do you believe that success comes to those who have a special bent or taste which they cultivate by hard work? I can only answer that out of my literary experience. For my own part, I believe I have never got any good from a book that I did not read merely because I wanted to read it. I think this may be applied to anything a person does. The book, I know, which you read from a sense of duty, or because for any reason you must, is apt to yield you little. This, I think, is also true of everything, and the endeavor that does one good, and lasting good, is the endeavor one makes with pleasure. Labor done in another spirit will serve in a way, but pleasurable labor brings, on the whole, I think, the greatest reward. Referring again to his early years, it was remarked, a definite literary ambition grew up in me, and in the long reveries of the afternoon, when I was distributing my case in the printing office, I fashioned a future of overpowering magnificence and undying celebrity. I should be ashamed to say what literary triumphs I achieved in those preposterous deliriums. But I realize now that such dreams are nerving, and sustain one in an otherwise barren struggle. Were you ever tempted and willing to abandon your object of a literary life for something else? I was, once. My first and only essay aside from literature was in the realm of law. It was arranged with a United States Senator that I should study law in his office. I tried it a month, but almost from the first day, I yearned to return to my books. I had not only to go back to literature, but to the printing office, and I gladly chose to do it, a step I never regretted. As to a happy life, it was said by Mr. Howells at the close of our interview, I have come to see life not as the chase of a forever impossible personal happiness, but as a field for endeavor toward the happiness of the whole human family. There is no other success. I know, indeed, of nothing more subtly satisfying and cheering than a knowledge of the real goodwill and appreciation of others. Such happiness does not come with money, nor does it flow from a fine physical state. It cannot be bought, but it is the keenest joy, after all, and the toiler's truest and best reward. End of Chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. John D. Rockefeller. The richest man in the United States, John Davidson Rockefeller, has consented to break his rule never to talk for publication, and he has told me the story of his early struggles and triumphs, and given utterance to some strikingly interesting observations anent the same. In doing so, he was influenced by the argument that there is something of helpfulness, of inspiration in the career of every self-made man. While many such careers have been prolific of vivid contrasts, this one is simply marvelous. Whatever may be said by political economists of the dangers of vast aggregations of wealth in the hands of the few, there can be no question of the extraordinary interest attaching to the life story of a man who was a farm laborer at the age of 15, who left school at 18 because he felt it to be his duty to care for his mother and brother, and who, at the zenith of his business career, has endowed Chicago University with $7,500,000 out of a fortune estimated at over $300 million, probably the largest single fortune on earth. The story opens in a fertile valley in Tioga County, New York, near the village of Richford, where John D. Rockefeller was born on his father's farm in July 1838. The parents of the boy were church-going, conscientious, debt-abhorring folk who preferred the independence of a few acres to a mortgaged domain. They were Americans to the backbone, intelligent, industrious people, not very poor, and certainly not very rich. For at 14 John hired out to neighboring farmers during the summer months, in order to earn his way, and not be dependent upon those he loved. His father was able to attend to the little farm himself, and thus it happened that the youth spent several summers away from home, toiling from sunrise to sunset, and sharing the humble life of the people he served. His early dreams and purpose. Did the tired boy peering from his attic window ever dream of his future? He said to a youthful companion of Richford, a farmer's boy like himself, "I would like to own all the land in this valley as far as I can see. I sometimes dream of wealth and power. Do you think we shall ever be worth $100,000, you and I? I hope to, some day." Who can estimate the influence such a life as this must have had upon the future multimillionaire? I asked Mr. Rockefeller about this, and found him enthusiastic over the advantages which he had received from his rural surroundings, and full of faith in the ability of the country boy to surpass his city cousin. "To my mind," he said, "there is something unfortunate in being born in a city. Most young men raised in New York and other large centers have not had the struggles which come to us who were reared in the country. It is a noticeable fact that the countrymen are crowding out the city fellows who have wealthy fathers. They are willing to do more work, and go through more for the sake of winning success in the end. Sons of wealthy parents haven't a ghost of a show in competition with the fellows who come from the country with a determination to do something in the world." The next step in the young man's life was his going to Cleveland, Ohio, in his 16th year. "That was a great change in my life," said he. "Going to Cleveland was my first experience in a great city, and I shall never forget those years. I began work there as an office boy, and learned a great deal about business methods while filling that position. But what benefited me most in going to Cleveland was the new insight I gained as to what a great place the world really is. I had plenty of ambition then, and saw that, if I was to accomplish much, I would have to work very, very hard indeed." School days. He found time during the year 1854 to attend the sessions of the school which is now known as the Central High School. It was a brick edifice surrounded by grounds which contained a number of hickory trees. It has long since been superseded by a larger and handsomer building. But Andrew J. Fries, the teacher, is still living. It is one of the proudest recollections of this delightful old gentleman's life that John D. Rockefeller went to school with him. I visited him at his residence in Cleveland the other day, and he said, "John was one of the best boys I had. He was always polite, but when the other boys threw hickory clubs at him or attempted any undue familiarities with him, he would stop smiling and sail into them." Young Hannah, Marcus A. Hannah, who was also a pupil, learned this to his cost more than once, and so did young Jones, the present Nevada senator. I have had several very distinguished pupils, you see, and one of my girls is now Mrs. John D. Rockefeller. I had Edward Wolcott, the Colorado senator, later on. Yes, John was about as intelligent and well-behaved a chap as I ever had. Here is one of his essays, which you may copy if you wish. Mr. Rockefeller, I am quite sure, will pardon me for copying his composition at this late day, for its tone and subject matter reflect credit upon him. Freedom is one of the most desirable of all blessings. Even the smallest bird or insect loves to be free. Take, for instance, a robin that has always been free to fly from tree to tree and sing its cheerful song from day to day. Catch it and put it into a cage which is to it nothing less than a prison, and although it may be there tended with the choicest care, yet it is not content. How eloquently does it plead, though in silence, for liberty! From day to day it sits mournfully upon its perch, meditating, as it were, some way for its escape. And when at last this is effected, how cheerfully does it wing its way out from its gloomy prison-house to sing undisturbed in the branches of the first tree. If even the birds of the air love freedom, is it not natural that man, the Lord of creation, should? I reply that it is, and that it is a violation of the laws of our country and the laws of our God that man should hold his fellow man in bondage. Yet how many thousands there are at the present time, even in our own country, who are bound down by cruel masters to toil beneath the scorching sun of the South. How can America, under such circumstances, call herself free? Is it extending freedom by granting to the South one of the largest divisions of land that she possesses for the purpose of holding slaves? It is a freedom that, if not speedily checked, will end in the ruin of our country." It was greatly to the regret of the teacher that John came to him one day to announce his purpose to leave school. Mr. Freeze urged him to remain 2 years longer in order that he might complete the course, but the young man told him he felt obliged to earn more money than he was getting because of his desire to provide for his mother and brother. He had received an offer, he said, of a place on the freight docks as a bill clerk, and this job would take him away from his studies. A raft of hoop poles. A short time afterwards, when Mr. Freeze visited his former pupil at the freight dock, he found the young man seated on a bale of goods, bill book and pencil in hand. Pointing to a raft of hoop poles in the water, John told his caller that he had purchased them from a Canadian who had brought them across Lake Erie, expecting to sell them. Failing in this, the owner gladly accepted a cash offer from young Rockefeller, who named a price below the usual market rates. The young man explained that he had saved a little money out of his wages, and that this was his first speculation. He afterwards told Mr. Freeze that he rafted the purchase himself to a flour mill and disposed of his bargain at a profit of $50. Footnote 3. This hoop pole story is matched by another, related by a friend, of Rockefeller's later warehouse days in Cleveland. He one day bought a lot of beans. He bought them cheap because they were damaged. Instead of selling them at a slight advance, as most dealers would have done, he spent all his spare time for weeks in the attic of his warehouse sorting over those beans. He took out all the blackened and injured ones, and in the end he got a fancy price for the remainder because they were of extra quality. The odor of oil. It was Mr. Freeze, too, who first got the young man interested in oil. They were using sperm oil in those days at $1.50 a gallon. Somebody had found natural petroleum, thick, slimy, and foul-smelling, in the Pennsylvania creeks, and a quantity of it had been received in Cleveland by a next-door neighbor of the schoolmaster. The neighbor thought it could be utilized in some way, but his experiments were as crude as the ill-favored stuff itself. These consisted of boiling, burning, and otherwise testing the oil, and the only result was the incurring of the disfavor of the nearby residents. The young man became interested at once. He, too, experimented with the black slime, draining off the clear portions and touching matches to it. The flames were sickly, yellow, and malodorous. "There must be some way of deodorizing this oil," said John, "and I will find it. There ought to be a good sale for it for illuminating purposes if the good oil can be separated from the sediment, and that awful smell gotten rid of." How well the young man profited by the accidental meeting is a matter of history. But I am digressing. His first ledger and the items in it. While in Cleveland, slaving away at his tasks, Mr. Rockefeller was training himself for the more busy days to come. He kept a small ledger in which he entered all his receipts and expenditures, and I had the privilege of examining this interesting little book, and having its contents explained to me. It was nothing more than a small paper-backed memorandum book. "When I looked this book up the other day, I thought I had but the cover," said Mr. Rockefeller, "but on examination I perceived that I had utilized the cover to write on. In those days I was very economical, just as I am economical now. Economy is a virtue. I hadn't seen my little ledger for a long time, when I found it among some old things. It is more than 42 years ago since I wrote what it contains. I called it Ledger A, and I wouldn't exchange it now for all the ledgers in New York City and their contents. A glance through it shows me how carefully I kept account of my receipts and disbursements. I only wish more young men could be induced to keep accounts like this nowadays. It would go far toward teaching them the value of money. Every young man should take care of his money. I think it is a man's duty to make all the money he can, keep all he can, and give away all he can. I have followed this principle religiously all my life, as is evidenced in this book. It tells me just what I did with my money during my first few years in business. Between September 1855 and January 1856, I received just $50. Out of this sum, I paid for my washing and my board, and managed to save a little besides. I find, in looking through this book, that I gave a cent to Sunday school every Sunday. It wasn't much, but it was all that I could afford to give to that particular object. What I could afford to give to the various religion and charitable works, I gave regularly. It is a good habit for a young man to get into. During my second year in Cleveland, I earned $25 a month. I was beginning to be a capitalist, said Mr. Rockefeller. And I suppose I ought to have considered myself a criminal for having so much money. I paid all my own bills at this time, and had some money to give away. I also had the happiness of saving some. I am not sure, but I was more independent then than now. I couldn't buy the most fashionable cut of clothing, but I dressed well enough. I certainly did not buy any clothes I couldn't pay for, as some young men do that I know of. I didn't make any obligations I could not meet, and my earnest advice is for every young man to live within his means. One of the swiftest toboggan slides I know of is for a young fellow just starting out into the world to go into debt. During the time between November 1855 and April 1856, I paid out just $9.09 for clothing. And there is one item that was certainly extravagant, as I usually wore mittens in the winter. This item is for fur gloves, $2.50. In the same period, I gave away $5.58. In 1 month, I gave to foreign missions 10 cents, to the Mite Society 50 cents, and 12 cents to the 5 Points Mission in New York. I wasn't living here then, of course, but I suppose I thought the mission needed money. These little contributions of mine were not large, but they brought me into direct contact with church work, and that has been a benefit to me all my life. It is a mistake for a man to think that he must be rich to help others. $10,000. He earned and saved $10,000 before he was 25 years old. Before he attained his majority, Rockefeller formed a partnership with another young man named Hewitt and began a warehouse and produce business. This was the natural outgrowth of his freight clerkship on the docks. In 5 years, he had amassed about $10,000, besides earning a reputation for business capacity and probity. He remembered the oil. He never forgot those experiments with the crude oil. Discoveries became more and more frequent in Pennsylvania oil territory. There was a rush of speculators to the new land of fortune. Men owning impoverished farms suddenly found themselves rich. Thousands of excited men bid wildly against each other for newly shot wells, paying fabulous sums occasionally for dry holes. Keeping his head. John D. Rockefeller looked the entire field over carefully and calmly. Never for a moment did he lose his head. His Cleveland bankers and business friends had asked him to purchase some wells, if he saw fit, offering to back him up with $75,000 for his own investment. He was worth about $10,000 at the time, and to put in $400,000 more on his report. The business judgment of this young man at 25 was so good that his neighbors were willing to invest $500,000 at his bidding. He returned to Cleveland without investing a dollar. Instead of joining the mad crowd of producers, he sagaciously determined to begin at the other end of the business, the refining of the product. There was more money in a refinery. The use of petroleum was dangerous at that time on account of the highly inflammable gases it contained. Many persons stuck to candles and sperm oil through fear of an explosion if they used the new illuminant. The process of removing these superfluous gases by refining, or distilling as it was then called, was in its infancy. There were few men who knew anything about it. Among Rockefeller's acquaintances in Cleveland was one of these men. His name was Samuel Andrews. He had worked in a distillery and was familiar with the process. He believed that there was a great business to be built up by removing the gases from the crude oil and making it safe for household use. Rockefeller listened to him and became convinced that he was right. Here was a field as wide as the world, limited only by the production of crude oil. It was a proposition on which he could figure and make sure of the result. It was just the thing Rockefeller had been looking for. He decided to leave the production of oil to others and to devote his attention to preparing it for market. Andrews was a brother commission merchant. The two started a refinery, each closing out his former business connection. In 2 weeks it was running night and day to fill orders. So great was the demand, and so great was the judgment of young Rockefeller, seeing what no one else had seen. A second refinery had to be built at once, and in 2 years their plants were turning out 2,000 barrels of refined petroleum per day. Henry M. Flagler, already wealthy, came into the firm, the name of which then became Rockefeller, Flagler, and Andrews. More refineries were built, not only at Cleveland but also at other advantageous points. Competing refineries were bought or rendered ineffective by the cutting of prices. It is related that Mr. Andrews became one day dissatisfied, and he was asked, "What will you take for your interest?" Andrews wrote carelessly on a piece of paper, $1 million. Within 24 hours he was handed that amount, Mr. Rockefeller saying, "Cheaper at 1 million than 10. In building up the refinery business, Rockefeller was the head, the others were the hands. He was always the general commanding, the tactician. He made the plans, and his associates carried them out. Here was the post for which he had fitted himself, and in which his genius for planning had full sway. In the conduct of the refinery affairs, as in every enterprise in which he had taken part, he exemplified another rule to which he had adhered from his boyhood days. He was the leader in whatever he undertook. In going into any undertaking, John D. Rockefeller has made it his rule to have the chief authority in his own hands, or to have nothing to do with the matter. Standard Oil. In 1870, when Mr. Rockefeller was 32 years old, the business was merged into the Standard Oil Company, starting with a capital of $1 million. Other pens have written the later story of that corporation, how it started pipelines to carry the oil to the seaboard, how it earned millions in byproducts which had formerly run to waste, how it covered the markets of the world in its keen search for trade, distancing all competition, and cheapening its own processes so that its dividends in 1 year, 1899, amounted to $23 million in excess of the fixed dividend upon the whole capital stock. This is the outcome of 30 years' development. The corporation is now the greatest business combination of modern times, or of any age of the world. Mr. Rockefeller's annual income from his holdings of Standard Oil stock is estimated at about $16 million. Mr. Rockefeller's personality. The brains of all this, the owner of the largest percentage of the stock in the parent corporation, and in most of the lesser ones, is now 62 years old. His personality is simple and unaffected, his tastes domestic, and the trend of his thoughts decidedly religious. His Cleveland residential estate is superb, covering a large tract of park-like land, but even there he has shown his unselfishness by donating a large portion of his land to the city for park purposes. His New York home is not a pretentious place, solid, but by no means elegant in outward appearance. Between the two homes he divides his time with his wife and children. He is an earnest and hard-working member of the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church in New York, and does much to promote the good work carried on by that organization. He is particularly interested in the Sunday school work. At the office. He arises early in the morning, at his home, and after a light breakfast attends to some of his personal affairs there. He is always early on hand at the great Standard Oil building on Lower Broadway, New York, and during the day he transacts business connected with the management of that vast corporation. There is hardly one of our businessmen of whom the public at large knows so little. He avoids publicity as most men would the plague. The result is that he is the only one of our very wealthy men who maintains the reputation of being different from the ordinary run of mortals. To most newspaper readers, he is a man of mystery, a sort of financial wizard who sits in his office and heaps up wealth after the fashion of Aladdin and other fairy-tale heroes. All this is wide of the mark. It would be hard to find a more commonplace, matter-of-fact man than John D. Rockefeller. His tall form, with a suggestion of a stoop in it, his pale, thoughtful face and reserved manner, suggest the scholar or professional man, rather than an industrial Hercules or a Napoleon of finance. He speaks in a slow, deliberate manner, weighing each word. There is nothing impulsive or bombastic about him, but his conversation impresses one as consisting of about 100% of cold, compact, boiled-down common sense. Here is to be noted one characteristic of the great oil magnate which has helped to make him what he is. The popular idea of a multimillionaire is a man who has taken big risks and has come out luckily. He is a living refutation of this conception. He is careful and cautious by nature, and he has made these traits habitual for a lifetime. He conducts all his affairs on the strictest business principles. Foresight. The qualities which have made him so successful are largely those which go to making of any successful businessman: industry, thrift, perseverance, and foresight. 3 of these qualities would have made him a rich man. The last has distinguished him as the richest man. One of his business associates said of him the other day, "I believe the secret of his success, so far as there is any secret, lies in power of foresight, which often seems to his associates to be wonderful. It comes simply from his habit of looking at every side of a question, of weighing the favorable and unfavorable features of a situation, and of sifting out the inevitable result through his unfailing good judgment." This is his own personal statement put into other words, so it may be accepted as true. The encouraging part of it is that while such foresight as Rockefeller displays may be ascribed partially to natural endowment, both he and his friend say that it is more largely a matter of habit, made effective by continual practice. Hygiene. At noon he takes a very simple lunch at his club or at some downtown restaurant. The lunch usually consists of a bowl of bread and milk. He remains at the office until late in the afternoon, and before dinner he takes some exercise. In winter he skates when possible, and at other seasons of the year he nearly always drives in the park or on the avenues. Mr. Rockefeller has great faith in the fresh air as a tonic. At home. The evenings are nearly always spent at home, for neither Mr. Rockefeller nor any of the children are fond of society, as the word is understood in New York. The children seem to have inherited many of their father's sensible ideas, and John D. Rockefeller, Jr. has apparently escaped the fate of most rich men's sons. He has a deep sense of responsibility as the heir apparent to so much wealth, and since his graduation from college he has devoted himself to a business career, starting at the bottom and working upward step by step. It is now generally known that he has been very successful in his business ventures, and he bids fair to become a worthy successor to his father. He is now actively engaged in important philanthropic enterprises in New York. Miss Bessie became the wife of a poor clergyman of the Baptist Church in Cleveland, while Miss Alta is married to a prominent young businessman in Chicago. Philanthropy. Mr. Rockefeller has during many years turned over to his children a great many letters from needy people, asking them to exercise their own judgment in distributing charities. While he has himself given away millions for education and charity, he would have given more were it not for his dread of seeming ostentatious. But he never gives indiscriminately nor out of hand. When a charity appeals to him, he investigates it thoroughly, just as he would a business scheme. If he decides that its object is worthy, he gives liberally. Otherwise, not a cent can be got out of him. It may be imagined that such a man is busy to the full limit of his working capacity. This is true. He is too busy for any of the pastimes and pleasures in which most wealthy men seek diversion. He is thoroughly devoted to his home and family, and spends as much as possible of his time with them. He is a man who views life seriously, but in his quiet way he can get as much enjoyment out of a good story or a meeting with an old friend as can any other man. Perseverance. When I asked Mr. Rockefeller what he considers has most helped him in obtaining success in business, he answered, "It was early training, and the fact that I was willing to persevere. I do not think there is any other quality so essential to success of any kind as the quality of perseverance. It overcomes almost everything, even nature. It is to be said of his business enterprises, looking at them in a large way, that he has given to the world good, honest oil of standard quality, that his employees are always well paid, that he has given away more money in benevolence than any other businessman in America, and everything about the man indicates that he is likely to persevere in the course he has so long pursued, turning his vast wealth into institutes for public service. A genius for money-making. "There are men born with a genius for money-making," says Matthews. "They have the instinct of accumulation, the talent and the inclination to convert dollars into doubloons by bargains or shrewd investments are in them just as strongly marked and as uncontrollable as were the ability and the inclination of Shakespeare to produce Hamlet and Othello, of Raphael to paint his cartoons, of Beethoven to compose his symphonies, or Morris to invent an electric telegraph. As it would have been a gross dereliction of duty, a shameful perversion of gifts, had these latter disregarded the instincts of their genius and engaged in the scramble for wealth, so would a Rothschild, an Astor, and a Peabody have sinned had they done violence to their natures and thrown their energies into channels where they would have proved dwarfs and not giants. The opportunity which came to young Rockefeller does not occur many times in many ages, and in a generous interpretation of his opportunity, he has already invested a great deal of his earnings in permanently useful philanthropies. End of Chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. The author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, her views of education for young women. A poet, author, lecturer, wit, and conversationalist, Mrs. Julia Ward Howe unites with the attributes of a tender, womanly nature, which has made her the idol of her husband and children. The sterner virtues of a reformer, the unflinching courage which dares to stand with a small minority in the cause of right, the indomitable perseverance and force of character which persist in the demand for justice in face of the determined opposition of narrow prejudice and old-time conservatism. Although more Bostonian than the Bostonians themselves, Mrs. Howe first saw the light in New York, and has spent much of her later life at Newport. Born in 1819 in a stately mansion near the Bowling Green, then the most fashionable quarter of New York, she was the fourth child of Samuel Ward and Julia Cutler Ward, people of unusual culture, refinement, and high ideals. Mr. Ward was a man of spotless honor and business integrity, and although not wealthy as compared with the millionaires of today, his fortune was ample enough to surround his wife and children with all the luxuries and refinements that the most fastidious nature could crave. Mrs. Ward possessed a rare combination of personal charms and mental gifts, which endeared her to all who had the privilege of knowing her. All too soon the death angel came and bore away the lovely young wife and mother, then in her 28th year. Rousing himself with a great effort from the grief into which the death of his wife had plunged him, Mr. Ward devoted himself to the training and education of his children. Far in advance of his age in the matter of higher education for women, he selected as the tutor of his daughters the learned Dr. Joseph Green Cogswell, with instruction to teach them the full curriculum of Harvard College. Little Miss Ward. The scholarly and refined atmosphere of her father's home, which was the resort of the most distinguished men of letters of the day, was an admirable school for the development of the literary and philosophic mind of the little Miss Ward, as Mr. Ward's eldest daughter had been called from childhood. Learned even beyond advanced college graduates of today, an accomplished linguist, a musical amateur of great promise, the young and beautiful Miss Julia Ward of Bond Street soon became a leader of the cultured and fashionable circle in which she moved. In the series Authors at Home by M.C. Sherwood, we get a glimpse of her about that time, in a whimsical entry from the diary of a Miss Hamilton, written at the time of the return of Dr. Howe from Greece, whither he had gone to fight the Turks. I walked down Broadway with all the fashion, and met the pretty blue-stocking Miss Julia Ward with her admirer, Dr. Howe, just home from Europe. She had on a blue satin cloak and a white muslin dress. I looked to see if she had on blue stockings, but I think not. I suspect that her stockings were pink, and she wore low slippers, as grandmamma does. They say she dreams in Italian and quotes French verses. She sang very prettily at a party last evening. I noticed how white her hands were. Still, though attractive, the muse is not handsome. She married a reformer. Soon after the loss of her father in 1839, Miss Ward paid the first of a series of visits to Boston, where she met, among other distinguished people who became lifelong friends, Sarah Margaret Fuller, Horace Mann, Charles Sumner, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. In 1843 she was married to the director of the Institute for the Blind in South Boston, the physician and reformer Dr. Samuel G. Howe, of whom Sidney Smith spoke, referring to the remarkable results attained in his education of Laura Bridgman, as, quote, a modern Pygmalion who has put life into a statue, unquote. Immediately after their marriage, Dr. and Mrs. Howe sailed for Europe, making London their first stopping place. There they met many famous men and women, among them Charles Dickens, Thomas Carlyle, Sidney Smith, Thomas More, the Duchess of Sutherland, John Forster, Samuel Rogers, Richard Monckton Milnes, and many others. After an extensive continental tour, including the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, France, and Italy, Dr. and Mrs. Howe returned home and took up their residence in South Boston. One of her friends has said, Mrs. Howe wrote leading articles from her cradle. And it is true that at 17 at least she was an anonymous but valued contributor to the New York Magazine, then a prominent periodical. In 1854 her first volume of poems was published. She named it Passion Flowers, and the Boston World of Letters hailed her as a new poet. Though published anonymously, the volume at once revealed its author, and Mrs. Howe was welcomed into the poetic fraternity by such shining lights as Emerson, Whittier, Longfellow, Bryant, and Holmes. The poem by which the author will be forever enshrined in her country's memory is, par excellence, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which, like Kipling's Recessional, sang itself at once into the heart of the nation. As any sketch of Mrs. Howe would be incomplete without the story of the birth of this great song of America, it is here given in brief. Story of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. It was in the first year of our Civil War that Mrs. Howe, in company with her husband and friends, visited Washington. During their stay in that city, the party went to see a review of troops, which, however, was interrupted by a movement of the enemy and had to be put off for the day. The carriage in which Mrs. Howe was seated with her friends was surrounded by armed men, and as they rode along, she began to sing, to the great delight of the soldiers, John Brown. "Good for you," shouted the boys in blue, who, with a will, took up the refrain. Mrs. Howe, then, began conversing with her friends on the momentous events of the hour, and expressed the strong desire she felt to write some words which might be sung to this stirring tune, adding that she feared she would never be able to do so. "She went to sleep," says her daughter, Maud Howe Elliot, "full of thoughts of battle, and awoke before dawn the next morning to find the desired verses immediately present to her mind. She sprang from her bed, and in the dim gray light found a pen and paper, whereon she wrote, scarcely seeing them, the lines of the poem. Returning to her couch, she was soon asleep, but not until she had said to herself, 'I like this better than anything I have ever written before.'" Of Mrs. Howe it may very fittingly be said that she is 80 years young. Her blue eye retains its brightness, and her dignified carriage betokens none of the feebleness of age. Above all, her mind seems to hold in a marvelous degree its youthful vigor and elasticity, a fact that especially impressed me as the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic expressed her views on the desirability of a college training for girls. "The girls who go to college," said Mrs. Howe, "are very much in request. I should say for everything, certainly for teaching. Then, naturally, if they wish to follow literature, they have a very great advantage over those who have not had the benefit of a college course, having a liberal education to begin with." "Which is the greater advantage to a girl, to have talent or great perseverance?" "In order to accomplish anything really worth doing, I think great perseverance is of the first importance. On the other hand, one cannot do a great deal without talent, while special talent without perseverance never amounts to much. I once heard Mr. Emerson say, 'Genius without character is mere friskiness.' And we all know of highly gifted people who, because lacking the essential quality of perseverance, accomplish very little in the world." "Do you think the college girl will exercise a greater influence on modern progress and the civilization of the future than her untrained sister?" "Oh, very much greater," was the quick, emphatic reply. "In the first place, I think that college-bred girls are quite as likely to marry as others, and when a college girl marries, then the whole family is lifted to a higher plane, the natural result of the well-trained, cultivated mind. Mothers of old, you know, were very ignorant. Indeed, it is sad to think what few advantages they had. Of course, some of them had opportunities to study alone, but this solitary study could not accomplish for them what the colleges, with their corps of specialists and trained professors, are doing for the young women of today." The ideal college. Speaking of the advantages and disadvantages of co-educational institutions, Mrs. Howe said, "While there are many advantages in co-education, there are also some dangers. The great advantage consists in the mingling of both sorts of mind, the masculine and the feminine. This gives a completeness that cannot otherwise be obtained. I have observed that when committees are made up of both men and women, we get a roundness and completeness that are lacking when the membership is composed of either sex alone. And so in college recitations, whether the boys present their side and the girls theirs, we get better results. This, of course, is natural. Fortunately, so far, scandals have been very rare, if found at all, in coeducation at colleges. Many people, however, would not care to trust their children, nor would we send every girl to such colleges, and for this reason I am glad that we have women's colleges. I think, however, that if the students are at all earnest and have high ideals set before them, the coeducational is the ideal college, for the course in these colleges is like a great intellectual race which arouses and stimulates all the nobler faculties. What influence do you think environment has on one's career, on success in life? What do you mean by environment? Well, I mean especially the sort of people with whom one is associated, their order of mind. I think it has a very important effect. If we are kept perpetually under lowering influences, lowering both morally and aesthetically, the tendency will inevitably be to drag us down. I say aesthetically, because I think in that sense good taste is a part of good morals. You can, of course, have good taste without good morals, but with morality there is a certain feeling or measure of reserve and nicety, which does not accompany good taste without good morals. You know, St. Paul says, "Evil communications corrupt good manners." That is as true today as it ever was. We can't always be with our equals or our superiors. However, we must take people as we find them. But we should try to be with people who stand for high things, morally and intellectually. Then, when we have to be among people of a lower grade, we can help them, because I think human nature on the whole desires to be elevated rather than lowered. Do you think it is necessary to success in life to have a special aim? I think it is a great thing to have a special aim or talent, and it is better to make one thing the leading interest in life than to run after half a dozen. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 14. A Talk with Edison. Dramatic Incidents in His Early Life. To discover the opinion of Thomas A. Edison concerning what makes and constitutes success in life is an easy matter, if one can first discover Mr. Edison. I camped 3 weeks in the vicinity of Orange, N.J., awaiting the opportunity to come upon the great inventor and voice my questions. It seemed a rather hopeless and discouraging affair until he was really before me, but, truth to say, he is one of the most accessible of men, and only reluctantly allows himself to be hedged in by pressure of endless affairs. "Mr. Edison is always glad to see any visitor," said a gentleman who was continually with him, "except when he is hot on the trail of something he has been working for, and then it is as much as a man's head is worth to come in on him." He certainly was not hot on the trail of anything on the morning when, for the 10th time, I rang at the gate in the fence which surrounds the laboratory on Valley Road, Orange. A young man appeared, who conducted me up the walk to the Edison Laboratory office. The library is a place not to be passed through without thought, for, with a further store of volumes in his house, It contains one of the most costly and well-equipped scientific libraries in the world. The collection of writings on patent laws and patents, for instance, is absolutely exhaustive. It gives, at a glance, an idea of the breadth of thought and sympathy of this man who grew up with scarcely a common school education. On the second floor, in one of the offices of the machine shop, I was asked to wait while a grimy youth disappeared with my card, which he said he would slip under the door of Mr. Edison's office. Curious, I thought. What a lord this man must be if they dare not even knock at his door. Thinking of this and gazing out the window, I waited until a working man, who had entered softly, came up beside me. He looked with a sort of, "Well, what is it?" in his eyes, and quickly it began to come to me that the man in the sooty, oil-stained clothes was Edison himself. The working garb seemed rather incongruous, but there was no mistaking the broad forehead, with its shock of blackish hair streaked with gray. The gray eyes, too, were revelations in the way of alert comprehensiveness. "Oh," was all I could get out at the time. "Want to see me?" he said, smiling in the most youthful and genial way. "Why, yes, certainly, to be sure," I stammered. He looked at me blankly. "You'll have to talk louder," said an assistant who worked in another portion of the room. "He don't hear well." This fact was new to me, but I raised my voice with celerity and piped thereafter in an exceedingly shrill key. After the usual humdrum opening remarks, in which he acknowledged his age as 52 years, and that he was born in Erie County, of Dutch parentage, the family having emigrated to America in 1730, the particulars began to grow more interesting. His great-grandfather, I learned, was a banker of high standing in New York, and when Thomas was but a child of 7 years, the family fortune suffered reverses so serious as to make it necessary that he should become a wage earner at an unusually early age, and that the family should move from his birthplace to Michigan. "Did you enjoy mathematics as a boy?" I asked. "Not much," he replied. "I tried to read Newton's Principia at the age of 11. That disgusted me with pure mathematics, and I don't wonder now. I should not have been allowed to take up such serious work." "You were anxious to learn?" "Yes, indeed. I attempted to read through the entire free library at Detroit, but other things interfered before I had done." A chemical newsboy. "Were you a bookworm and dreamer?" I questioned. "Not at all," he answered, using a short, jerky method, as though he were unconsciously checking himself up. "I became a newsboy, and I liked the work. Made my first coup as a newsboy in 1869. "What was it?" I ventured. "I bought up on futures 1,000 copies of the Detroit Free Press, containing important war news, gained a little time on my rivals, and sold the entire batch like hotcakes. The price reached 25 cents a paper before the end of the route," and he laughed. "I ran the Grand Trunk Herald, too, at that time, a little paper I issued from the train." "When did you begin to be interested in invention?" I questioned. "Well," he said, "I began to dabble in chemistry at that time. I fitted up a small laboratory on a train." In reference to this, Mr. Edison subsequently admitted that, during the progress of some occult experiments in this workshop, certain complications ensued, in which a jolted and broken bottle of sulphuric acid attracted the attention of the conductor. He, who had been long suffering in the matter of unearthly odors, promptly ejected the young devotee and all his works. This incident would have been only amusing but for its relation to and explanation of his deafness. A box on the ear, administered by the irate conductor, caused the lasting deafness. Telegraphy. "What was your first work in a practical line?" I went on. "A telegraph line between my home and another boy's. I made with the help of an old river cable, some stovepipe wire, and glass bottle insulators. I had my laboratory in the cellar and studied telegraphy outside." "What was the first really important thing you did?" "I saved a boy's life." "How?" "The boy was playing on the track near the depot. I saw he was in danger and caught him, getting out of the way just in time. His father was station master and taught me telegraphy in return." Dramatic situations appear at every turn of this man's life. He seems to have been continually arriving on the scene at critical moments, and always with the good sense to take things in his own hands. The chance of learning telegraphy only gave him a chance to show how apt a pupil he was, and the railroad company soon gave him regular employment. At 17, he had become one of the most expert operators on the road. "Did you make much use of your inventive talent at this time?" I questioned. "Yes," he answered. "I invented an automatic attachment for my telegraph instrument, which would send in the signal to show I was awake at my post when I was comfortably snoring in a corner. I didn't do much of that, though," he went on, "for some such boyish trick sent me in disgrace over the line into Canada." "Were you there long?" "Only a winter. If it's incident you want, I can tell you one of that time. The place where I was in Sarnier, the American town, were cut off from telegraphic and other means of communication by the storms, until I got at a locomotive whistle and tooted a telegraphic message. I had to do it again and again, but eventually they understood over the water and answered in the same way." According to his own and various recorded accounts, Edison was successively in charge of important wires in Memphis, Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Louisville. He lived in the free and easy atmosphere of the tramp operators, a boon companion with them, yet absolutely refusing to join in the dissipations to which they were addicted. So highly esteemed was he for his honesty, that it was the custom of his colleagues, when a spree was on hand, to make him the custodian of those funds which they felt obligated to save. On a more than usually hilarious occasion, one of them returned rather the worse for wear, and knocked the treasurer down on his refusal to deliver the trust money. The other depositors, we may be glad to note, gave the ungentlemanly tippler a sound thrashing. His use of money. "Were you good at saving your own money?" I asked. "No," he said, smiling. "I never was much for saving money, as money. I devoted every cent, regardless of future needs, to scientific books and materials for experiments. You believe that an excellent way to succeed? Well, it helped me greatly to future success." Inventions. "What was your next invention?" I inquired. "An automatic telegraph recorder, a machine which enabled me to record dispatches at leisure, and send them off as fast as needed." "How did you come to hit upon that?" "Well, at the time, I was in such straits that I had to walk from Memphis to Louisville. At the Louisville station they offered me a place. I had perfected a style of handwriting which would allow me to take legibly from the wire, longhand, 47 and even 54 words a minute, but I was only a moderately rapid sender. I had to do something to help me on that side, and so I thought out that little device." Later, I discovered an article by one of his biographers, in which a paragraph referring to this Louisville period says, "True to his dominant instincts, he was not long in gathering around him a laboratory, printing office, and machine shop. He took press reports during his whole stay, including on one occasion the presidential message by Andrew Johnson, and this at one sitting from 3:30 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. He then paragraphed the matter he had received over the wires, so that printers had exactly 3 lines each, thus enabling him to set up a column in 2 or 3 minutes' time. For this, he was allowed all the exchanges he desired, and the Louisville press gave him a dinner." "How did you manage to attract public attention to your ability?" I questioned. "I didn't manage," said the wizard. "Some things I did created comment, a device that I invented in 1868, which utilized one submarine cable for 2 circuits, caused considerable talk, and the Franklin Telegraph Office of Boston gave me a position. It is related of this, Mr. Edison's first trip east, that he came with no ready money and in a rather dilapidated condition. His colleagues were tempted by his hayseed appearance to salt him, as professional slang terms the process of giving a receiver matter faster than he can record it. For this purpose, the new man was assigned to a wire manipulated by a New York operator famous for his speed, but there was no fun at all. Notwithstanding the fact that the New Yorker was in the game and was doing his most speedy clip, Edison wrote out the long message accurately, and, when he realized the situation, was soon firing taunts over the wire at the sender's slowness. "Had you patented many things up to the time of your coming East?" I queried. "Nothing," said the inventor, ruminatively. "I received my first patent in 1869. For what? A machine for recording votes and designed to be used in the state legislature." "I didn't know such machines were in use," I ventured. "They aren't," he answered with a merry twinkle. "The better it worked, the more impossible it was. The sacred right of the minority, you know. Couldn't filibuster if they used it, didn't use it." "Oh! Yes, it was an ingenious thing. Votes were clearly pointed and shown on a roll of paper by a small machine attached to the desk of each member. I was made to learn that such an innovation was out of the question, but it taught me something, and that was to be sure of the practical need of, and demand for, a machine before expending time and energy on it. Is that one of your maxims of success?" "It is. It is a good rule to give people something they want, and they will pay money to get it." His arrival at the metropolis. In this same year, Edison removed from Boston to New York, friendless and in debt on account of the expenses of his experiment. For several weeks he wandered about the town with actual hunger staring him in the face. It was a time of great financial excitement, and with that strange quality of fortunism which seems to be his chief characteristic, he entered the establishment of the Law Gold Reporting Company just as their entire plant had shut down on account of an accident in the machinery that could not be located. The heads of the firm were anxious and excited to the last degree, and a crowd of the Wall Street fraternity waited about for the news which came not. The shabby stranger put his finger on the difficulty at once, and was given lucrative employment. In the rush of the metropolis, a man finds his true level without delay, especially when his talents are of so practical and brilliant a nature as were this young telegrapher's. It would be an absurdity to imagine an Edison hidden in New York. Within a short time he was presented with a check for $40,000 as his share of a single invention, an improved stock printer. From this time a national reputation was assured him. He was, too, now engaged upon a duplex and quadruplex systems for sending 2 and 4 messages at the same time over a single wire, which were to inaugurate almost a new era in telegraphy. Mental concentration. Recalling the incident of the Law Gold Reporting Company, I inquired, "Do you believe want urges a man to greater efforts, and so to greater success?" "It certainly makes him keep a sharp lookout. I think it does push a man along." "Do you believe that invention is a gift or an acquired ability?" "I think it's born in a man." "And don't you believe that familiarity with certain mechanical conditions and defects naturally suggests improvements to anyone?" "No. Some people may be perfectly familiar with a machine all their days, knowing it inefficient, and never see a way to improve it." "What do you think is the first requisite for success in your field or any other?" "The ability to apply your physical and mental energies to one problem incessantly, without growing weary. 20 hours a day." "Do you have regular hours, Mr. Edison?" I asked. "Oh," he said, "I do not work hard now. I come to the laboratory about 8 o'clock every day and go home to tea at 6, and then I study or work on some problem until 11, which is my hour for bed." 14 of 15 hours a day can scarcely be called loafing," I suggested. "Well," he replied, "for 15 years I have worked on an average of 20 hours a day." When he was 47 years old, he estimated his true age at 82, since working only 8 hours a day would have taken till that time. Mr. Edison has sometimes worked 60 consecutive hours upon one problem. Then, after a long sleep, he was perfectly refreshed and ready for another. A run for breakfast. Mr. Dixon, a neighbor and familiar, gives an anecdote told by Edison, which well illustrates his untiring energy and phenomenal endurance. In describing his Boston experience, Edison said he bought Faraday's works on electricity, commenced to read them at 3 o'clock in the morning, and continued until his roommate arose, when they started on their long walk to get breakfast. That object was entirely subordinated in Edison's mind to Faraday, and he suddenly remarked to his friend, "Adams, I have got so much to do, and life is so short, that I have got to hustle. and with that I started off on a dead run for my breakfast. I've known Edison since he was a boy of 14, said another friend, and of my own knowledge I can say he never spent an idle day in his life. Often, when he should have been asleep, I have known him to sit up half the night reading. He did not take to novels or wild western adventures, but read works on mechanics, chemistry, and electricity, and he mastered them too. But in addition to his reading, which he could only indulge in at odd hours, he carefully cultivated his wonderful powers of observation, till at length, when he was not actually asleep, it may be said he was learning all the time. Not by accident and not for fun. Are your discoveries often brilliant intuitions? Did they come to you while you were lying awake nights? I asked him. I never did anything worth doing by accident, he replied, nor did any of my inventions come indirectly through accident, except the phonograph. No, when I have fully decided that a result is worth getting, I go about it and make trial after trial until it comes. I was singing to the mouthpiece of a telephone, said Edison, when the vibrations of my voice caused a fine steel point to pierce one of my fingers held just behind it. That set me to thinking. If I could record the motions of the point and send it over the same surface afterward, I saw no reason why the thing would not talk. I determined to make a machine that would work accurately, and gave my assistants the necessary instructions, telling them what I had discovered. That's the whole story. The phonograph is the result of the pricking of a finger. I have always kept, continued Mr. Edison, strictly within the lines of commercially useful inventions. I have never had any time to put on electrical wonders, valuable only as novelties to catch the popular fancy. I like it, I hate it. What makes you work? I asked with real curiosity. What impels you to this constant, tireless struggle? You have shown that you care comparatively nothing for the money it makes you, and you have no particular enthusiasm for the attending fame. What is it? I like it, he answered, after a moment of puzzled expression. I don't know any other reason. Anything I have begun is always on my mind, and I am not easy while away from it, until it is finished, and then I hate it. Hate it, I said. Yes, he affirmed. When it is all done and is a success, I can't bear the sight of it. I haven't used a telephone in 10 years, and I would go out of my way any day to miss an incandescent light. After I have completed an invention, remarked Edison upon another occasion, I seem to lose interest in it. One might think that the money value of an invention constitutes its reward for the man who loves his work, but, speaking for myself, I can honestly say this is not so. Life was never more full of joy to me than when, a poor boy, I began to think out improvements in telegraphy, and to experiment with the cheapest and crudest appliances. But now that I have all the appliances I need, and am my own master, I continue to find my greatest pleasure, and so my reward, in the work that precedes what the world calls success. Doing one thing 18 hours is the secret. You lay down rather severe rules for one who wishes to succeed in life, I ventured, working 18 hours a day. Not at all, he said. You do something all day long, don't you? Everyone does. If you get up at 7 o'clock and go to bed at 11, you have put in 16 good hours, and it is certain with most men that they have been doing something all the time. They have been either walking, or reading, or writing, or thinking. The only trouble is that they do it about a great many things, and I do it about one. If they took the time in question and applied it in one direction, to one object, they would succeed. Success is sure to follow such application. The trouble lies in the fact that people do not have an object, one thing to which they stick, letting all else go. Success is the product of the severest kind of mental and physical application. Possibilities in the electrical field. You believe, of course, I suggested, that much remains to be discovered in the realm of electricity? It is the field of fields, he answered. We can't talk of that, but it holds the secrets which will reorganize the life of the world. You have discovered much about it, I said, smiling. Yes, he said, and yet very little in comparison with the possibilities that appear. Only 600 inventions. How many inventions have you patented? "Only 600, he answered, "but I have made application for some 300 more." "And do you expect to retire soon, after all this?" "I hope not," he said, almost pathetically. "I hope I will be able to work right on to the close. I shouldn't care to loaf." His courtship and his home. The idea of the great electrician's marrying was first suggested by an intimate friend, who told him that his large house and numerous servants ought to have a mistress. Although a very shy man, he seemed pleased with the proposition, and timidly inquired whom he should marry. The friend, annoyed at his apparent want of sentiment, somewhat testily replied, "Anyone." But Edison was not without sentiment when the time came. One day, as he stood behind a chair of a Miss Stilwell, a telegraph operator in his employ, he was not a little surprised when she suddenly turned round and said, "Mr. Edison, I can always tell when you are behind me or near me." It was now Miss Stilwell's turn to be surprised, for, with characteristic bluntness and ardor, Edison fronted the young lady, and, looking her full in the face, said, "I've been thinking considerably about you of late, and, if you are willing to marry me, I would like to marry you." The young lady said she would consider the matter, and talk it over with her mother. The result was that they were married a month later, and the union proved a very happy one. It was, in fact, no more an accident than other experiments in the Edison laboratory. His bride having been long the subject of the wizard's observation, her mental capacity, her temper and temperament, her aptitude for homemaking being duly tested and noted. End of chapter 14.